Hello, my name is Dave Beaudoin, the news editor here at Ballotpedia. Thank you so much for joining us for the second of our 3 election week briefings discussing the results of the 2020 elections. We've been tracking races, compiling results, and analyzing data for 2 days here at Ballotpedia. And there's still a lot to be counted and determined, but some results are starting to come into focus. And today, we're going to pay attention to ballot measures. As voters decided statewide measures in 32 states. Now the vote counting is continuing all across the country, and the outcome has not been decided for all of these measures, but we do have some results. And to discuss all of this with me here today is Josh Altic, who is project director from our ballot measures team. So Josh, it's so great to have you with us.
Hi Dave, yeah, good to be here.
All right, so let's start with what I believe did not get any competition for the most expensive ballot measure of the entire cycle, and that was California's Prop 22. Can you explain that one and what were the results?
That's right, most expensive for the cycle and probably in the history of California. We've confirmed at least back through 1999, but with over 200 million spent just on the support side, this is a record breaker. So yeah, Proposition 22 is a citizen initiative that was sponsored by Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Postmates, Instacart, and those app-based driver companies. And it was really a reaction to AB 5, which reclassified or set rules for classifying who could be an independent contractor and who had to be classified as an actual employee. Of course, you can imagine the repercussions there with regard to things like minimum wage, benefit requirements, and all the other things that go along with being an actual employee. So this measure would have sort of carved out an exception for app-based drivers. It would have classified app-based drivers as independent contractors, and it passed. Voters were in favor of it. It was kind of a referendum on Uber, and it was approved, as you can see, by 58%. So what that means is that app-based drivers can continue to be independent contractors in California. It also means that there's some new requirements, such as a wage floor and certain training requirements and certain insurance requirements that go into effect now as well. So definitely an interesting one and a first of its kind.
Yeah, there was a lot of discussion about that. And as we've said, a lot of money was poured into the campaign. Now, sticking in California, they always have, or generally always have, quite a few ballot measures, and this year was no exception. So there were some other high-profile ballot measures out in the Golden State as well. What can you say about, have any of those been decided? Have they all been decided?
Yeah, there are a few left that are close. Proposition 15, for example, a very interesting property tax measure, which is still close. But yeah, like you said, California always has a lot of measures, and it's one of the trend-setting states. It's a state where the stakes are higher. So jumping back to Proposition 16 is a good example, and 22. These are more important than just the state. I think the stakes are higher, especially like with 22, which is sort of a first of its kind on gig economy. The first time voters have ever voted on gig economy, and then Prop 16 is kind of not a first of its kind, but it's another measure where it's about a measure that was the first of its kind. So Proposition 16 was defeated, and it was designed to repeal Proposition 209, which was approved decades ago, and was the first of its kind at the time. And what it did was ban preferential treatment and discrimination based on a list of characteristics, including sex, race, ethnic origin. What that effectively did was ban affirmative action policies, certain affirmative action policies that took these characteristics into account. So this measure was really designed to repeal that measure and therefore allow affirmative action based on sex and race, certain policies. It wouldn't have permitted things that were still banned federally, things like certain types of quotas or other types of affirmative action that aren't allowed, but it would have allowed certain programs that gave preference based on those characteristics. And I think this was a surprise to some people that it failed 6 points, and we were able to call it pretty early. But definitely an interesting result and an interesting measure with a lot of history.
Now I know the California ballots, ballots in California, because it's an all-mail state, tend to come in, over a long period of time. Historically, Has there been much change to ballot measure results from votes that are received in the days after election day?
Yeah, it's one of the states that we're more cautious in. The results can certainly swing one way or the other by a few points, and more than other states for sure. But so that's why you'll see there are some measures that we haven't been able to call in California.
Okay, and then you said there were a couple other notable ballot measures out in California as well, right?
Yeah, plenty of them. So let's talk about just a couple more. I encourage you to go to Ballotpedia and actually look, because there's a lot going on that we're not going to get to today. But another measure that was interesting that we're not able to call is Proposition, well, we'll talk about 25 first. Proposition 25 we have called, it was defeated. And this was one of the rare veto referendums. There are only 3 veto referendums on the ballot in 2020 in 3 different states. In November, there was one earlier in March. So this was, what was at stake here was whether or not California would become the first state to get rid of its cash bail program for determining whether people waiting a criminal trial could be released. And so this would have replaced it with risk assessments. And the legislature passed this change in 2019. They made the change to risk assessment, sort of a system that didn't involve cash bail, but involved a metric for determining the risk of the accused. So the veto referendum was challenging that. So the no result here means that the group that collected signatures for this measure won. They put it on the ballot, and the voters disagreed with the legislature and sided with the petitioners and decided to keep the system in place now, the cash bail system. So interesting, and this is a criminal justice law enforcement topic that you'll see kind of a pattern of in a lot of the results from the election as well.
So this overturns what had been the bill that had been passed by the legislature and I guess signed by the governor.
That's correct, yeah. It overturned the Senate Bill 10.
Okay, and then the last one we're going to talk about, although we could probably talk about, as you said, all of them,
right,
is Proposition 15, right?
Yeah, so this one is, as you see, is very close. It's currently down by a few points, so 51% voting against it, but it's one we're not comfortable calling yet, as results can still swing by that much. But this is another, you'll see kind of this trend of policies being reworked or reconsidered, and this is no exception. This would amend and overturn parts of Proposition 13 from the 90s in California, which basically limited the amount that property could be assessed at. So going into the election in California, property was assessed at its purchase price, and then it could only increase by 2% or inflation, whichever is less, every year. So as you know, if you're familiar with real estate in California, the increase in property value is often more than 2%. So as property values skyrocketed, you had assessment rates that were sort of left way behind. So this would enact what was called split roll. So it would mean that that system would continue for residential properties, but it would, for commercial and industrial properties, they would be assessed at market value going forward, which would obviously increase their assessment by quite a bit and was anticipated to increase revenue by 6 to 11 billion long term every year, kind of a gradual increase. So kind of a lot of interesting things at stake here, a lot of money for education and local government at stake. And as you can see, it's a close race. It's looking like it might be defeated, but we're not willing to call this one yet.
And just to be clear, if this measure, if the results stay the way they are and the measure is defeated, it leaves the current system the way it is. Is that right?
That's correct. That would be a vote in favor of the status quo, just to leave Proposition 13 fully in effect.
Okay. All right. So let's move off of California and look more at some of the topics that we have historically seen become pretty predominant in ballot measures cycle after cycle, and essentially how they got manifested with the measures that took place this year. So a nice segue, since we just talked about taxes, is income taxes. And the one that I think got a lot of media attention outside of the California measures that I saw was the Illinois measure that would have changed from a flat rate tax to a graduated income tax. How did that measure fare?
Yeah, I think I was a little bit surprised by the results on this one. So this amendment, like you said, it would have allowed for a graduated income tax. And this was policy that Governor Pritzker kind of ran his campaign based around, and he was very adamant about passing it. In fact, he invested over 50 million of his own money into passing this measure. And on the other side, you had a lot of spending from the CEO of Citadel against it. So a couple of unique things about this measure. First of all, it was the most expensive measure outside of California this year, with over 120 million spent, which is also why it got so much attention, because there were so many ads and so much sort of hype being paid for. So this measure, it required a 60% supermajority or a simple majority of those voting on the election. And honestly, based on the polling, I was anticipating not being able to call this measure for some time. But it ended up being down by 55% against, which I was very surprised by. And I think that's a testament to the No campaign. I think they did a really good job using the immense amount of money they had. So the other unique thing about this measure is that when you have so much money, 120 million outside of California is shocking. I think it's probably the most expensive measure in Illinois' history that we know of. But when you see that, you have David and Goliath races usually, where a huge amount of money is on one side and not so much on the other. This one was dead even. Less than $1 million separated the 60 million plus campaigns that were fighting over this measure. It was kind of a shootout between Pritzker and the CEO of Citadel, and the anti-tax sentiment kind of won out in the end.
Yeah, this created an interesting dichotomy, I thought, between Pritzker's election in 2018, which was, I don't recall the exact margin, but he was elected, and obviously he's been governor. It was a cornerstone of his campaign, and now you have the actual policy initiative that he, very strongly associated with during that campaign, and it appears to have gone down to defeat.
Yeah, that is interesting.
All right, so sticking with the thought about taxes, there was another measure in Colorado, I think, right?
Yeah, this measure is kind of, it would have, so there's I mean, the idea is very simple. It would decrease the flat income tax rate in Colorado from 4.63% to 4.55%, and voters liked it. The story behind this one is interesting, I think, because there's some thought that it was proposed kind of as not a counter, but as a counterpart to another proposal in Colorado that did not make the ballot, to do the same as what Illinois was trying to do, create a graduated income tax rate instead of a flat one. That measure did not make the ballot. So the scenario was a little simpler. You didn't have two kind of competing ideas going at the same time. But instead, you just got a tax decrease of a couple of percentage points.
Now, in Colorado, does any change to the personal income tax have to get approved by the voters statewide?
Any tax increase does in Colorado because of Colorado's sort of notorious Tabor law. But a tax decrease the legislature could have put that into effect themselves. This was a citizen initiative, though. Okay. So it's not a ballot through a signature petition.
So this was done not by the legislature, but the legislature could do that themselves.
Yeah, to my understanding, they have the ability to decrease that tax rate.
Okay, makes sense. And then there was one more tax measure you wanted to talk about, which was in Arizona, I think.
Yeah, and this one we haven't quite called yet as well. This is a surtax on income above a certain level. So $250,000 for single filers and $500,000 for double filers or for joint filers. So this would have been a 3.5% tax on that income above that level, and it would have gone to education, teacher salaries, and schools. And this is an interesting idea, I think, largely because it's one that's been tried in other states. Massachusetts had a measure that qualified for the ballot in 2018, but then was kicked off. And I think they're trying for another one in 2022. And it's an idea it's kind of sometimes called a millionaire's tax idea, and it's usually tied to education that doesn't just exist in Arizona. It's nationally relevant. So I think a lot of eyes are on the results here, and it's ahead, 52% in favor. So we'll just have to see how the rest of the results come down in Arizona.
Right, and as we're seeing with the presidential race, there's still a decent amount of uncounted votes in that state. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. All right, let's move to another topic, and this has become, pretty prevalent in terms of looking at ballot measures over the last several cycles, and that is states that are having voters decide whether or not to approve the use of recreational and or medical marijuana. And there were several of those initiatives that were on the ballot this year. How did they fare?
Right, there was a clean sweep for marijuana. They all got approved. So you might think that marijuana is just kind of a boring topic at this point, but there are some interesting firsts this year that I'd love to point out. One of them is just so the states that approved recreational marijuana are Montana, South Dakota, Arizona, and New Jersey. And then medical marijuana was also on the ballot in Mississippi, and that passed, and in South Dakota. So South Dakota voted on both medical and recreational marijuana. But if you just look at the three more western states, Montana, South Dakota, Arizona, what jumps out to me is that those are actually the first states that voted red from 2000 to 2016. Obviously, Arizona is still up in the air a little, but might have flipped. And so that doesn't apply for 2020. But in the past, these are reliably red states. And it's the first time that recreational marijuana has been approved in sort of a more reliably red state. It was defeated in Arizona in 2016 by a narrow margin. But I think this is actually a pretty notable step forward for the marijuana movement, because there was some thought that they'd gone as far as they could with citizen initiatives, passing them in some more left-leaning states, or at least divided states. So interesting first step there. And then New Jersey, I think, also has an interesting element to it.
Yeah, I know New Jersey, having just lived there, I just moved out of the state, but I know Governor Murphy campaigned on that when he was elected in 2017, that was something that he supported. And I think most voters that I talked to when I was living over there were kind of surprised that it took as long as it did for that measure to either find its way to the ballot or to get approved by the legislature. You said that in New Jersey, they kind of took an approach that you didn't expect.
Right. Well, it's the first time that a marijuana measure, legalization for recreational, has been referred to the voters by the legislature. So there's two states, Illinois and Vermont, that the legislature passed marijuana legalization. But this is the first time it's been sent to the voters. And yeah, like you said, the story behind that New Jersey measure kind of goes back to 2017 and to Murphy. And Murphy preferred passing it directly, not putting it on the ballot. But in the end, they did not quite have the votes to pass legalization directly. So they did have the votes, just barely to put it on the ballot. So that's what the route they went, and an interesting first, and it paid off. Voters for the movement, for advocates, it paid off. The movement proceeds, and New Jersey passed the measure, I think, comfortably. I can't remember the exact margins.
And any thoughts as to the likelihood, what would be your guess right now as to how many states will be looking at either a medical or a recreational marijuana measure in 2022?
Oof, don't ask me to talk about 2022 yet. 2020 just ended. I don't know for sure. I know that there were certainly some efforts that did not make the ballot in 2020. In some ways, you could point to the pandemic as a reason. In some other cases, they didn't work out. But I think you could see it potentially in Florida. Florida passed medical marijuana through the ballot initiative process, so you could see it there. I know Missouri has talked about recreational marijuana, or advocates in Missouri. Yeah, it's hard to say exactly how 2022 will shape up now, but it's not going to stop, that's for sure.
Yeah, I didn't mean to bring up 2022. We're only 2 days removed from 2020, but it is true that a lot of these measures, the process to get them on the ballot does take a very, very long time. So I'm sure people that are thinking about, the next cycle have to move, especially in the current environment, with the pandemic limiting some of the things that were traditionally done.
Right. Yeah.
All right, and then one more issue, sort of related, maybe, is the measures that happened that were, I think, both approved in Oregon. Can you explain a little bit about those? Yeah,
so kind of keeping with the drug policy topic, while we're familiar with marijuana, this is kind of a big firsts for psilocybin and some other drug policies. So in Oregon, voters approved by 56%. The first sort of statewide measure to legalize a program for psilocybin mushroom use. And it's an interesting program. It means that there will be certain service centers where adults over 21 can go and kind of have a session that's administered by someone who's observing them the entire time. So it's not like you can grow mushrooms in your backyard and go that way. So for that reason, some of the stronger advocates for psilocybin or psychedelic mushrooms were actually opposed to this measure because it has kind of a rigid structure that goes along with it. So yeah, that was interesting. And then kind of another measure to look at was District of Columbia. Washington D.C. voters approved a measure to decriminalize mushrooms, but also any other entheogenic plant or substance. So things like iboga or peyote, those were all decriminalized in the District of Columbia.
All right, and then there was another measure, Measure 110, that was passed that had to do with the state's policy towards decriminalization of certain amounts of drugs. Is that right?
Right. So this one is almost, it's interesting to me that this one passed by a higher margin than the psilocybin mushroom measure. This measure really is kind of a shift in how Oregon deals with drug crime. It has sort of two key provisions, and you can order them in different ways. But one of them is to decriminalize, so to change from either a misdemeanor or in some cases a felony, the personal, non-commercial, or non-distributive possession of all drugs, Schedule 1 through 4. So that goes to, from in some cases having thousands of dollars or potentially other penalties, to having a maximum of $100 fine for personal possession of those drugs. And then an alternative to the $100 fine is an assessment by a health center. And the idea is to pair that with the other sort of main provision of the measure, which is a sort of massive, first of its kind drug treatment addiction program. That program is going to be funded by certain marijuana revenue and prison savings expected from the decriminalization of drugs. So a shift towards sort of addiction treatment and away from criminal prosecution and penalties for drug-related crimes.
And this is one you would probably say is kind of a, first of its kind measure, and see, whether or not other states adopt something similar in future years.
Right. Yeah. There's been other states, if you look to Oklahoma or California, that have addressed at the ballot the sort of severity of penalties associated with certain crimes, and those usually include drug-related crimes, but sometimes there's certain theft or non-violent crimes thrown in there as well. So it's definitely part of a sort of a let's reevaluate our criminal justice system trend. But as far as the details go, and as far as sort of the widespread decriminalization of the drugs and the sort of expansive nature of this addiction treatment program, it is certainly a notable and kind of a first ever.
All right, very interesting. All right, we are chewing through time at a pretty rapid rate here, but there's definitely some other things we want to get to, like election policy. And there was a handful of measures all across the country related to voting and election policy. How did those do?
Yeah, there were over 20 measures we were tracking about elections, and there's some about campaign finance and redistricting. I think what we're going to touch on today is the measures that changed or tried to change election systems. Up first, ranked choice voting was on the ballot in 2 states. It was kicked off the ballot in 2 others very close to the election, but these are the 2 that actually voted on it. And they did not fare well. So far, the Massachusetts measure failed, 54, almost 55% against it. And that would have enacted ranked choice voting for statewide elections, primaries and general. And then Alaska had a really unique measure as well. Besides ranked choice voting for general election, it would have enacted the first ever top 4 primary system. And that one, it looks like it's failing. I mean, I think we're on the verge of calling this one. At 57 points down, it's close to being defeated. I think we're waiting just a couple more reports to come in. But it looks like ranked choice voting did not fare well at the statewide ballot. At the local level, there are actually 5 cities that look to be approving ranked choice voting for city elections.
And then speaking of top 4, there was a measure in Florida to do a top 2 primaries. And it appears that also did not pass.
Right.
So some of these election changes, we're not going to be seeing those implemented necessarily.
Yeah. Now the top 2 proposal in Florida did get a lot more support. You see there 57% in favor, but that measure in Florida, as all constitutional amendments in Florida, requires a 60% supermajority vote. So that failed and won't go into effect. The final margin, though, is probably not discouraging to advocates.
Okay, so it's possible they may try again or whatnot, since it didn't miss by much, and it was approved by a majority.
Right.
And then another state, Colorado, I guess, is looking to join the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And we've talked about that in other briefings in the past, but it looks like we've called that one as a yes as well.
Yeah. So that was approved. So Colorado will add will pledge its 9 electoral votes to the compact, which doesn't go into effect until the compact has 270 electoral college votes worth of states. So right now it's at, well, it was at 187 before the election. So that plus 9, I can't do math. But I would say the one thing that sticks out to me about this one is, well, A, it was a veto referendum. The first veto referendum in Colorado since, I think, 1932, so it's been a while. But then B, it's the first time voters have actually decided this issue. So there was a lot at stake for this measure, just kind of for the movement as a whole. Some people were saying, well, if this fails, the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is kind of, it's not going to work out. It's going to stop. And I think this is kind of at least given some life to the idea. In all the other 14 states that have approved it, it's just been legislative action. And Colorado tried to pass it through legislative action in the governor's signature. And this veto referendum was a kind of an effort to repeal that, an effort that ultimately did not succeed.
Okay. And then the big topic, once all of these elections are decided and whatever happens after that, I think the big topic we're all going to be focusing on at Ballotpedia is going to be redistricting. And you said there was a handful of redistricting measures that were on the ballot this year. How did they do?
Yeah, they all passed. They're all very different, though. So I encourage you to go look at the details at Ballotpedia or elsewhere. Virginia Question 1 is kind of your more traditional, let's pass a bipartisan redistricting commission measure. So we've seen that a lot in 2018. But there's a lot of nuance to how that got on the ballot and the ultimate positions of the political parties on that measure. New Jersey's measure is quite simple. It just allows redistricting to be delayed. So if COVID ends up delaying census data, it allows the state to do that without being in violation of its constitution. And Missouri, it's too complicated to get into now. It repealed the first ever state demographer before the state demographer could ever actually do anything. So that's what happened there. It's a repeal of a 2018 initiative, more or less, and with a bunch of other interesting provisions as well. So lots of details to dive into if you are interested in how Missouri will be doing its redistricting after the 2020 census.
Okay, and like I said, this will be a topic that I'm sure we'll be diving into quite a bit in 2021. All right, I know we're really close, in fact, right at the edge of time, but there's a couple other measures that I think were particularly notable. Let's see if we can just kind of fly through those. One of them, Florida, $15 minimum wage.
Yeah, and the AP has called this, and New York Times has called this. So you can see there's 60% approval, which is huge, but it's only a 0.8 margin above that 60% supermajority requirement. So it's still fairly narrow, but it looks like this measure passed. The most notable thing, it's the first time voters have actually voted on a $15 per hour minimum wage. So that sort of magic number behind the movement. Other minimum wage measures, of course, are familiar. They're always on the ballot, but this is the first time that number has been on the ballot. And it would go to $10 an hour right away in 2021, and then increase by $1 per year until $15 in 2026. So that's how that measure would work.
Gotcha. And all Florida amendments have a 60%.
That's correct. Yeah.
All right. Colorado is instituting a new program related to paid medical and family leave.
Yeah, Colorado had, I think, 3 pretty notable first evers on their ballot. And this is one of them. So the paid medical leave, it would enact a program paid for by a payroll tax of between 0.9% and 1.2%. That would give between 12 and 16 weeks of paid medical or family leave. This would be a state-run program, and I think that's what sticks out is that this is sort of, well, I think 7 or 8 other states have programs similar to this. This is the first time voters have decided on sort of a state-run, kind of longer-term paid medical leave program like this. And one more notable thing, the payroll tax would be split between employees and employers, 50-50. So yeah, you can see this one passed by 57%, pretty easy victory. An interesting policy that could apply to any state. So we'll see if this is a trendsetter or just a one-off.
Yeah, well, that's like we've been talking about. This may be one of those things we may see again or not. 2 more to go. Last one was of a lot of interest to people who like cars or involved in the automobile industry in Massachusetts.
Yeah, I think one thing that sticks out is that this measure was extremely expensive. I think it was the 6th most expensive measure in 2020, and I think the 2nd most expensive measure outside of California. Essentially, it had to do with wireless data access for vehicle diagnostic data. It was kind of, as far as campaign finance goes, it was a shootout between dealerships and independent auto shops and AutoZone and things like that. The opposition side was very concerned about data security, because it does require a wireless two-way data system for all vehicles sold in Massachusetts going forward, or new vehicles. But I think voters apparently weren't convinced by the security risk argument, and they, as you can see, are overwhelmingly in favor of kind of allowing this more independent availability of data access for them fixing their own cars, or being able to go to their independent auto shops and have them fixed more easily.
So I guess, would this replace the code reader that you plug into underneath your dashboard for this kind of diagnostic data?
That's the idea, yeah. So back in 2013, there was a right to repair law that was passed in Massachusetts after a really confusing combination of initiative and legislative action. And it exempted telematics and wireless access. So that concerned, plugging your little gadget into your car. I don't know much about cars, but so this requires, if your car has a telematic system with wireless access availability, then this requires there to be a platform by which independent auto dealerships and personal owners can access that through an application on their phone.
Got it. So this opens that platform up a little bit.
Right.
All right, last one. Who doesn't want to have fun with flags?
Yeah.
Got a new flag.
Yeah, 72% of voters liked the state flag with the state flower on it, the magnolia. So at stake here was simply whether or not this flag became the flag of Mississippi. Going into the election, Mississippi did not have a flag. Earlier, the Mississippi legislature and the governor signed a bill that removed the official status of the state's flag, which had the bars and stars, the Confederate battle flag symbol, and was the last state to have that in their flag. So that was removed, and there was no avenue back to getting sort of that flag. So this one was proposed by a commission and put on the ballot, and voters liked it. So thumbs up, no need for a 2021 redo of this. So yeah, you have a new state flag in Mississippi.
Yeah, that would have been interesting that if this referendum had failed, there would have basically had another one in 2021 with a different design.
Right.
I was already seeing on my social media feed that people are saying that this flag, this new Mississippi flag, automatically jumps into the top 10 in state flags nationwide. That's how much people, at least all over the country, think this is a really nice design.
It was designed partly through kind of online input. They had hundreds of designs and then narrowed it down and then had people vote online. So it was an interesting process, kind of a fun one to watch, as maybe a little more lighthearted than some of the other races, because the Confederate symbol had already been officially removed. There wasn't really a big contentious ballot measure race. It was just, what do you like for your flag?
Yeah, that's a really great point. Okay, we ran a little bit long, but this was just so much great information, and it's been a really great wrap up. So thank you so much for catching up on all of this, Josh.
Yeah, no problem. Sorry I talked so much.
That's all right. It's been great info. All right, election results on these measures and all of the other races are still being counted, and our analysis of all of this data is continuing. And of course, there's still a lot to be determined, including the presidential race, the battle for control of the Senate and various House seats, and so on and so forth. And we have all the latest information on our website at ballotpedia.org. I really invite you to go and check back with us often to get the latest information. We also, as I mentioned in the beginning, have another briefing, our third one, the last in the series of post-election briefings. David Lukes from the Marquee team will be with me tomorrow to discuss notable trends and results from state level and down ballot races across the country. So that one will be really interesting. If you haven't done so already, go ahead and register. It'll be great. It is at noon Eastern, 11 Central, which is the same time as this one. So we look forward to seeing you there. And in addition to staying up on things on our website, we have all of our email newsletters, including the Daily Brew, which comes out every weekday, and our weekly newsletter, The Tap. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks for watching, everyone.